Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we're continuing our journey to see if we can identify who is the creator. We've gone through this topic of were we created or are we the product of a naturalistic process, and we've settled on we were created. Now we're trying to figure out the who part. As we get into this discussion, we're going to focus heavily on how do we know that this Bible that's sitting here next to me is reliable? How do we know that it hasn't been corrupted or that it's not packed full of errors or all of these things? I know there's a lot of people out there yelling things at the camera right now. Don't worry. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how we know that what's in the pages of this Bible is reliable or not. But thinking about that, it got me thinking about where we are in our culture, where we are today as a people. And it's such a remarkable journey that we've taken. When I was growing up as a kid in the 1970s, I can still remember, we had 4 channels, and I was the remote. And when we wanted to change the channel, my dad would tell me, go flip the channel. And that was it. And that's how television was. You had one television in the house. It was a giant console, so it was a big piece of furniture with maybe a 27-inch screen in the middle. And television was a very different thing. I can remember when the Olympics would come on or something like that. You would have this grainy image of terrible quality, but it would have across the bottom live via satellite. And that was an amazing thing in the 1970s, to think that we could be watching something that was happening clear over on the other side of the world, but into the 80s and stuff on the old ABC Wide World of Sports. And I can still remember watching that as a kid and thinking what an amazing time that we were growing up in. Today, I can go flip on the computer and pull up a webcam anywhere around the world, and in any major city around the world or something like that. I can watch Kilauea volcano erupting in Hawaii live as it's actually happening. I mean, the things that we can do today with technology are remarkable, and we have become an extremely visual society as all of that has happened. And there's good points and bad points to that. The old saying used to be seeing is believing, but just looking around YouTube and poking around the internet, you quickly come to realize that's not true anymore. Seeing is not believing, because AI has come along so far that what we're able to produce with AI or things like that, it's remarkable what we can do now with imagery. I remember seeing Rogue One. I've always been a Star Wars fan. And I remember going to the theaters and seeing Rogue One, and onto the screen walks Peter Cushing. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's Tarkin, there he is. Except it wasn't. I mean, it was, but I was like, I thought Peter Cushing was dead. Well, he had been. Cushing had died long before. But there, generated by AI, generated by special effects, CGI, there's Peter Cushing on the screen. And other than a little bit around the mouth, he was pretty believable. And you kind of looked at that and went, oh my goodness, if we can do that, what is it that we can't do? And when we think about the movies that have followed since, with things like Avatar and all of these things, where the vast majority of the movie, none of it's actually real. Most of it is all computer generated and things like that. Seeing isn't believing anymore like it used to be. And I think about the journey that we've taken. When I look back in my childhood, we used to have, the written word was tremendously important. The spoken word was important too, but to a very different degree. There was a very large trust in the media. We can't even define what we agree as the media is anymore. But I was thinking, growing up, Walter Cronkite was known as, some of you may remember this, some of you my age, the most trusted man in America. And the idea that any member of the news media would be called the most trusted man or woman in America is a bit laughable these days. I went out online and looked up what percent of the American people trust the media. And I think the number that it came back on online was 31%. And that probably sounds about right. And even that, there's a huge question of how do you define the media? So we live in this remarkable age nowadays where we have all of this information available at our fingertips, and we have things that we never could have dreamed about 20 years ago. But I think we have less trust of things now than we've ever had before, and there's probably good reason for that. So one of the things I want us to think about as we're going forward, when we consider how do we analyze what's written in the pages inside this book that's survived for, well, I was going to say 2,000 years, the New Testament portion of it, 2,000 years, the Old Testament of it, another 1,500 years back before that. How do we trust what's written in the pages of this book? And how do we know? What do we trust? How do we know who we trust and why do we trust things? And I want to put on the table this idea of eyewitness testimony. We're going to talk a lot about that in the weeks to come and in the months to come. You know, as I was thinking about this and thinking about eyewitness testimony, my grandfather came to mind. And I had a really interesting opportunity to get to know both of my grandfathers. They both lived a very long life, and they both had a fascinating life story to tell. But one of my grandfathers, in particular in this regard, was an early teenager when World War II started. He had just turned 15 about a month before World War II started, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And he enlisted. He and my great-grandfather went down, and he enlisted in the military and was fighting in the Pacific very quickly at a very early age. And it's always humbled me when I think about what a very different childhood I had at the age of 15 to 20 than what my grandfather had. And I look back on those years and what he fought in the Pacific and the things that he had to have seen and done. And I can't begin to imagine. And what's interesting was the stories that he told myself and my cousins and my uncles and my dad. When he would tell us stories, it was amazing to watch his eyes light up. And he never told us. He was always very careful. He very rarely spoke about battles, about the horrors of the conflict that he had seen. When he did, it was always something funny that happened. It was the funny things that happened in between the battles. It was the silly things that he did as a teenager and fighting in the let's see, that would have been Marine Corps. You know, looking back at what he did, he would tell us the funny stories, the stories that he liked remembering. And over the years, as he would tell the stories, the details that he included, you know, sometimes he would include different details, and sometimes he would leave out some of those details. But the story never changed, and the details never changed. It was just a question of whether or not he included them. Those things that he told us, those stories that he relayed to us from his childhood that changed his life for forever, were just burned into his memory. And as an eyewitness, the things that he saw were beyond imagination. But yet I could watch his eyes light up and I could hear him tell me stories. And as I go back and see things on television now, or on the internet now, I really should say, and they talk about how these battles and things like that went, I'm like, yeah, that was just like what my grandpa told me. Or when he was stationed in Japan after the war, the stories that he told were just something I never ever would have imagined. But no matter how old he was, he never forgot. Those images were just burned into his mind. And what I want to suggest to you as we go forward, one of the things that we're going to talk about is that a great deal of the testimony that we have contained in the pages of the New Testament in particular is eyewitness testimony. And we're going to talk about that. I'm not going to put that out there and just walk away and leave it. But I want to put that out there, and we're going to talk a great deal about that down the road. And what I want you to consider is how important this was for those people who were telling these stories, who were relaying what we have today in the 4 biographies that we have of Jesus' life. You know, one of the things I was thinking about as we do this is, you know, today we take a Bible when we go into court, and you sit down and you're getting ready to testify as a witness, and you place your hand on the Bible, and the judge would ask you, we've all seen it on TV like a million times, do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And with your hand on that Bible, it's supposed to mean something very sacred to us. And you say, I do. And I was thinking about that and going forward and how important this is to us as a culture. You know, this has always been one of those things as a culture where we stand as neighbors, we stand as fellow members of a community to ensure that justice is done, to ensure that the innocent go free and that the guilty are punished for the crimes that they've committed. What's critically important to that is this idea of eyewitness testimony. I'm going to quote a lot from Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It is a tremendous read and one that I would recommend to anybody who hasn't read it. But he talks about this idea about eyewitness testimony. And he says, trusting testimony is not an irrational act of faith that leaves critical rationality aside. It is, on the contrary, the rationally appropriate way of responding to authentic testimony. He's right. And I think most of the time in our lives, we all consider that to be true. When we sit down and have a meeting, I don't haul out a Bible for the people that I work with and go, is the testimony that you're about to give today the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I accept their testimony as what legitimately happened. I accept it as the truth. When I get home from work and my wife says, how was your day? She doesn't haul out a Bible for me to swear that the testimony I'm about to give is true. She takes it at face value. And she reads me pretty well. Normally speaking, she can tell if I've had a good day or a bad day without me ever saying, oh my goodness, let me tell you what happened. We trust testimony of people that we consider to be reliable. That's going to be critical every day of our lives. That's how we function as a society. If you think about the number of people whose testimony that you simply take for granted when you talk to them every day, we do this all the time. But the question is reliability. The question is, do we believe they're a reliable and faithful witness? And that's what we're going to look to do as we walk through this in the next few weeks. What we're going to establish and what we're going to look at is the testimony that we have reliable? What are the tests? What do we use? Because really what we become this visual society, but I think what we've proven looking online at what AI can do and CGI can do, our eyes can deceive us. We've got to find something that's reliable, something that we know to be true. And reliable eyewitness testimony is the foundation of that. And again, as we use that in our everyday lives, it's not inappropriate to use it here in this situation. I was struck by a quotation from Eusebius, and again, writing thousands of years ago, and he's quoting from one of the early church fathers, Quadratus. And what he says here makes perfect sense when we think about it, but it's something that's kind of been taken away from us that we don't oftentimes consider. And this is talking about the eyewitnesses who were there after Jesus died, who were going to be there spreading the message of the early church. He says, the works of our Savior were always present, for they were true. Those who were healed, those who rose from the dead, those who were not only seen in the act of being healed or raised, but were also always present, not merely when the Savior was living on the earth, but also for a considerable time after his departure, so that some of them survived even to our own times. So this is one of the early church fathers, and he's trying to describe how the gospel message spread as it was being spread orally and as it was being committed to writing. And what he's saying is, when you read in the Bible those stories about Lazarus being raised from the dead, when Jesus died and was raised and was gone then, Lazarus didn't just go away. When we think about Jairus' daughter who was raised from the dead, she didn't disappear. Or Bartimaeus, who was healed, who had been blind his whole life and then could see. He didn't just disappear from the scene. And what Richard Bauckham does in his book that we're going to be talking about a lot is identifying when we see something written in the pages of the four Gospels, a lot of times it's very likely identifying for us who was the source material for what we're talking about. And you're going to see it. It's amazing to read through that and to understand how ancient bibliographies were written and how in ancient documents we came to know and understand who the author was referring to as the eyewitnesses, who were his sources as he was writing something down. And we're going to talk about that a lot. So what I wanted to put forward before you is this idea, don't let the skepticism that we have in our modern culture today overwhelm a reasonable approach to how, from a literary perspective, we've always looked at documents and considered, are these documents reliable or are these documents unreliable? And if they are these witnesses reliable? And how can we look at that and decide? And you're going to be, I think, impressed when we talk about that and determine, is this eyewitness testimony acceptable? Is it reasonable to conclude based on what the testimony is that these are the events that actually happened? So I wanted to put that out there this week as we're moving forward and thinking about that. And again, Please consider that as we go forward. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the Bible a little bit more. And we're going to really touch base on this question of, can we consider what's written in the pages of the Bible as a reasonable guide for us as we go forward, as one of our sources? I think what you'll find is the answer is yes. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Next week, we're going to tackle that topic. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have, please consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. It really helps our podcast to get out there if you'll hit that subscribe button. If you've got questions for us, please don't put them in the comments. I try to read the comments every now and again, but email those questions to me at prooftoggrace@yahoo.com. And you can also find helpful information on our website at prooftoggrace.com. You can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. And I hope to find you here this same time next week. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have an amazing and blessed week. Bye-bye.